The beginning of Rome's financial downfall, the Roman Empire, at its peak, was one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. It stretched from Britain to the Middle East and North Africa. It was known for its powerful military, advanced infrastructure, and impressive achievements in art, architecture, and law. However, despite all its strength and power, the Roman Empire eventually collapsed. While many people think the downfall was due to invasions by barbarian tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Huns, there was another, deeper cause of Rome's fall: economic mismanagement. One of the most significant causes was the way the Roman government handled its money, especially its decision to print cheap money, which ultimately led to inflation and weakened the empire from within. For a long time, the Roman Empire had a strong economy. The Roman currency, made from precious metals like gold, silver, and bronze, was trusted by the people. These coins had value because of the metals they were made from. But as the empire grew larger, the demands on the Roman government became bigger. The need for more soldiers, more resources, and more public works like roads and buildings became overwhelming. To meet these demands, the Roman government started to print more money. However, they didn't print paper money like we use today. Instead, they minted more coins. But the key problem here was that the new coins were made from less valuable metals, which caused the coins to lose their value over time. This decision, although made to solve a short-term financial problem, eventually led to the downfall of the empire. The decision to print cheap money, or debase the currency, set off a chain of events that contributed to the collapse of the empire. Let's dive into how this happened. The early days of Rome's economy. In the early days of the Roman Empire, the economy was relatively simple but very effective. The Romans used a system of coins made from metals such as gold and silver. The value of these coins was based on the metal they contained, so everyone knew they had real value. The economy worked well because the coins were trusted, and they made trade easier both within the empire and with other nations. Roman coins weren't just used for buying and selling goods. They also served as a symbol of Roman power. Coins were often stamped with images of Roman emperors or gods, which reinforced the idea that the Roman government was strong and capable. Because these coins were made from precious metals, they were considered valuable, and people were confident in using them for transactions. Rome's economy also thrived because of its extensive trade network. The Romans traded goods like olive oil, wine, and pottery. They also imported goods from other parts of the world. This network helped Rome's economy grow. Agriculture was another important part of the economy. Roman farmers produced a large portion of the food needed to support the empire's people, and many people worked as farmers or in other industries. The pressure of an expanding empire, however, as the empire grew, so did its problems. The Roman Empire wasn't just a small city-state anymore. It had expanded across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. This meant that Rome needed a larger military to protect its borders, more government officials to manage the empire, and more resources to keep everything running smoothly. The costs of running the empire increased dramatically. The Roman government needed more money to pay for its growing military, to fund public works, and to maintain the empire. This created a problem for the empire's leaders because they didn't have enough money in the treasury to cover all these costs. They faced a serious financial crisis, and they needed a solution quickly. Initially, the Roman government tried to raise more money by increasing taxes. But this wasn't a popular solution, and it only added to the financial burden on the people. So the Roman government decided to print more coins. At first, this seemed like a good solution. They could make more money without raising taxes. But the problem was that they didn't have enough precious metals, like gold and silver, to create more coins. So they started using cheaper metals like copper, tin, and bronze and mixed these metals with the silver and gold in the coins. This practice is known as debasement of the currency. Debasement is when the government reduces the value of the coins by lowering the amount of precious metal in them. The coins still had the same face value, but their actual value based on the metal they contained was much lower. This was the first step in what would become a financial disaster for the Roman Empire. The effects of debasement. Inflation at first, the Roman government didn't notice any immediate problems. The new coins were still used in trade, and they were accepted by the people. However, over time, the effects of debasement began to show. As more and more coins were minted, the value of the Roman currency began to decrease. People realized that the coins were worth less than they had been before, and they started to lose trust in the currency. This loss of trust led to inflation. Inflation is when prices rise because the value of money falls. As the Roman government printed more money, the amount of valuable goods available did not increase. So the price of everyday items like food, clothing, and other necessities went up. This meant that the money the average Roman earned no longer bought as much as it had before. A loaf of bread that used to cost a few coins now costs several times more. This situation was very difficult for the ordinary people of Rome. Farmers, merchants, and workers, who earned a set amount of money each day, found that their wages no longer covered their basic expenses. As prices rose, their quality of life dropped. For many people, this was the beginning of a financial struggle that would continue to worsen. The impact on soldiers. Another group that felt the impact of inflation were the Roman soldiers. The Roman army was one of the most powerful in the world, but it was also expensive to maintain. Soldiers were paid in Roman coins, and as the value of those coins decreased, soldiers found that their pay no longer had the same purchasing power. They began to demand higher wages to make up for the rising cost of living. The Roman government responded by printing even more money to meet the soldiers' demands. But this just made the situation worse. The more money the government printed, the less valuable it became. This created a vicious cycle where the government had to print more and more money to pay the military, and this further devalued the currency. As the soldiers' pay became worth less, their morale began to suffer. The loyalty of the Roman army was vital to the empire's survival, but as the economy worsened, soldiers became more dissatisfied. Some soldiers even started to desert their posts or rebel against their commanders, weakening the military. This created another major problem for the empire, as the Roman military had always been the key to maintaining order and defending the empire's borders. The decline of trade. The inflation caused by debasing the currency also had a major impact on trade. As the value of Roman coins dropped, foreign traders became reluctant to accept them. Traders from other countries preferred to deal in gold or silver, which were more stable than Roman coins. As a result, the flow of goods into and out of the empire slowed down. This decline in trade made the Roman economy even weaker. Goods that were once imported from other regions, like luxury items, spices, and fine fabrics, became harder to find. The Roman Empire's economy, once a bustling center of trade, began to shrink. Fewer goods were being exchanged, and the quality of life for many people in the empire began to deteriorate. The decline in trade also made the Roman Empire more isolated. As fewer goods were traded with other parts of the world, the empire's economy became weaker and more self-contained. This limited Rome's ability to recover from its financial problems. Social unrest. As the financial situation in Rome worsened, social unrest began to grow. The gap between the rich and the poor became wider. The wealthy were able to protect themselves from inflation by investing in land or other assets that maintained their value. The poor, however, were stuck with money that had lost much of its value. As everyday items became more expensive, the poor were no longer able to afford the basic necessities. The frustration of the people grew, and riots became more common in the streets of Rome. The government, desperate to control the situation, responded with force. Soldiers were sent to suppress the protests, but this only made the situation worse. The people of Rome, who had already lost trust in their leaders, became more disillusioned and angry. Social unrest spread throughout the empire. The breakdown of government control. As the empire's economy continued to weaken, the Roman government became less able to respond to the challenges it faced. The emperor's authority began to erode, and the government's ability to make decisions was increasingly questioned. The once powerful Roman Empire began to fracture into smaller, less unified regions. Military commanders, who had become more powerful, began to make their own decisions and even declared themselves emperors, further weakening the central government. The combination of economic instability, social unrest, and political fragmentation made it harder for Rome to defend itself against external threats. The empire, once so powerful and stable, was now vulnerable to attacks from barbarian tribes and other enemies. Conclusion: the dangers of economic mismanagement. The fall of the Roman Empire wasn't just caused by invasions from outside. It was also caused by the empire's internal problems, especially its economic mismanagement. The decision to print cheap money, through debasing the currency, was the key turning point. This decision, made out of desperation to fix short-term financial problems, created long-term consequences. Inflation, social unrest, and a weakened military all resulted from this decision. Rome's experience with printing cheap money serves as a warning. It shows how financial decisions, if not handled carefully, can lead to the collapse of even the most powerful empires. The Romans learned the hard way that economic stability is crucial for the survival of a civilization. The fall of Rome was not just due to external threats, but because of the internal financial instability caused by the mismanagement of their economy. The political and military consequences of Rome's economic collapse. In the first part of this series, we explored how the Roman Empire's financial troubles, caused largely by the debasement of currency and the printing of cheap money, set off a series of events that contributed to the empire's collapse. Inflation, the devaluation of money, and the subsequent social unrest weakened Rome's economy. However, the economic collapse didn't just stop there. It had far-reaching effects that spread into politics and the military, which were critical to the empire's stability. As we continue, we'll dive into how the Roman political system weakened and how the Roman military, once the empire's backbone, began to crumble. The internal struggles caused by economic mismanagement would contribute directly to the empire's inability to defend itself from both internal revolts and external invasions. These consequences of the economic collapse were critical in the fall of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. The political fragmentation of Rome. One of the first areas to feel the effects of economic instability was the political system. At its height, the Roman Empire had a well-organized, centralized government. The emperor, while not always perfect, held ultimate authority. This system allowed the empire to function as a unified whole. But as the economy began to collapse, so did the ability of the Roman government to function properly. As inflation worsened, the government became less able to manage the empire's vast territories effectively. The problems of currency devaluation and increasing social unrest caused many Romans to lose faith in their leaders. In the midst of this turmoil, political instability took root. The emperor's position was once seen as the pinnacle of power, but as the economy faltered, the emperor's authority started to diminish. Emperors were now seen as weak and ineffective, unable to solve the empire's pressing issues. This created a situation where local leaders, military commanders, and even provincial governors began to assume more power. The loyalty of these local leaders was often to their region, rather than to the empire as a whole. The economic problems also led to an increase in corruption. As the Roman Empire became more fragmented, local leaders and military commanders saw opportunities to gain power for themselves. They began to act more like independent rulers than loyal subjects of the emperor. In many cases, military commanders who had once fought for the Roman emperor were now taking matters into their own hands. They would declare themselves emperor or start their own empires in the provinces, further weakening the unity of the Roman Empire. This political fragmentation made it difficult for the central government to govern effectively. The empire was no longer under the control of a strong central authority, and local military leaders often acted with complete independence. This lack of unity contributed greatly to the empire's fall because it made it easier for enemies to invade and conquer parts of the empire without facing a strong, coordinated defense. The rise of military power and decline in loyalty. The Roman army had always been the backbone of the empire. Its success in battle had allowed Rome to expand and maintain its vast empire. But as the economy collapsed, so did the strength and unity of the Roman military. The soldiers, who had once been proud defenders of Rome, were now suffering from the effects of inflation, which devalued their pay. As we saw in Part 1, soldiers began to demand higher wages to keep up with rising prices. The government responded by printing more money, but this only worsened the inflation problem. This created a vicious cycle that left the soldiers feeling underpaid and increasingly disillusioned. With the economy struggling, soldiers began to look for other sources of income and security. Many soldiers, rather than staying loyal to the Roman emperor, began to follow military leaders who offered them higher wages or better conditions. These military leaders, often generals with their own private armies, were able to offer soldiers more than the emperor could. As a result, the loyalty of the Roman army began to decline. Soldiers who once fought for Rome's glory were now fighting for their own survival. This decline in military loyalty made the empire more vulnerable to both internal and external threats. The military commanders who gained power through their soldiers began to challenge the authority of the emperor. They saw themselves as more capable leaders, especially since the central government had failed to solve the empire's economic crisis. These military commanders began to declare themselves emperors, leading to a situation where multiple people claimed the throne at the same time. This division of power made it harder for Rome to respond to external threats because the army was divided, and the empire was left without a clear leader. The decline in military discipline and loyalty made it more difficult to defend the empire's borders. Once, the Roman army had been a force to be reckoned with, keeping enemies at bay and maintaining peace within the empire. Now, the Roman military was divided, weakened by economic problems, and less capable of defending the empire against foreign invaders. Rome's internal struggles had made it more vulnerable than ever before. The decline of Roman infrastructure. In addition to the military and political issues, the collapse of the Roman economy had a serious impact on the infrastructure that had once made Rome great. The Romans were known for their advanced engineering, building roads, aqueducts, and public buildings that stretched across the empire. These infrastructure projects were vital for communication, trade, and military movement. But as the economy declined, the money for such projects became scarce. The lack of funds meant that many of the vital public works projects in the empire were left unfinished or allowed to decay. Roads that were once the lifeblood of Roman trade and military movement were no longer maintained. Aqueducts that carried water to Roman cities were neglected, causing water shortages in some areas. This breakdown in infrastructure made it harder for the empire to function as it had before. The lack of efficient transportation and communication networks made it more difficult to organize military defense, move resources, or even govern effectively. Roman cities, which had once been centers of culture and trade, began to suffer. Without the infrastructure that had made them successful, they began to fall into disrepair. The decline of cities, once bustling with activity, led to a loss of wealth and resources which further weakened the empire's economy. The impact of barbarian invasions. As the Roman Empire became more fragmented and weakened, the borders of the empire became more vulnerable to invasion. Rome had long faced threats from barbarian tribes living outside its borders. These groups, such as the Goths, Vandals, and Huns, had been on the fringes of the empire for centuries, but as the empire weakened, these tribes saw an opportunity to invade. The empire's inability to respond effectively to these invasions was directly tied to its political and military problems. As we mentioned earlier, the Roman military was no longer united and local leaders were acting independently. The emperor could no longer rely on the army to protect the empire's borders because the army itself was divided and often focused on internal power struggles. The economic collapse had made it harder for Rome to maintain its military strength, and as a result, the empire found itself facing increasing invasions from barbarian tribes. In the 5th century AD, the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, famously sacked Rome in 410 AD. This was a major blow to the empire, and it showed just how vulnerable Rome had become. The empire's inability to defend itself from invaders was a sign of how much it had weakened over the years. The Visigoths' invasion marked the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. Other tribes, such as the Vandals and the Huns, followed suit, further weakening the empire. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had been overrun by these barbarian groups. The last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD, marking the official fall of the Western Roman Empire. The rise of the Byzantine Empire. Although the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for several more centuries. The Byzantines, based in Constantinople, inherited much of the culture, law, and political structure of the old Roman Empire. However, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire marked the end of the ancient Roman civilization in the West. The Byzantines would continue to influence European culture and politics, but Rome itself was no longer the central power. Lessons from Rome's fall. The fall of the Roman Empire offers many lessons for us today. One of the most important lessons is the danger of ignoring economic problems and relying on short-term fixes. Rome's decision to print more money to solve its financial problems was a key factor in its downfall. This decision led to inflation, weakened the military, caused social unrest, and contributed to the political fragmentation of the empire. The Roman Empire was once a great civilization, but its inability to manage its finances and adapt to changing conditions ultimately led to its collapse. The collapse of Rome also shows the importance of maintaining unity in both the military and political leadership. When the Roman army became divided and the political leadership fractured, the empire became more vulnerable to attacks from both internal and external forces. A unified, strong leadership is critical to the survival of any nation or empire. Finally, Rome's fall teaches us the importance of infrastructure and communication. The Roman roads, aqueducts, and buildings were key to the empire's success. Without them, the empire struggled to function properly. Today, we can see how important infrastructure is to the success of any nation, as it helps keep things running smoothly, whether it's for trade, communication, or military defense. The long-term effects and cultural decline of Rome, as we have seen in the previous parts. The Roman Empire's collapse was caused by a combination of economic mismanagement, military decline, and political instability. However, the fall of Rome had far-reaching consequences that lasted for centuries. The economic collapse, loss of political unity, and military breakdown didn't just affect the Roman Empire itself, but also caused ripple effects throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. While the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, continued for almost another 1,000 years. The collapse of the Western Empire, however, marked the end of ancient Roman culture in the West and signaled the beginning of what we now call the Dark Ages. This period was characterized by the disintegration of centralized power, economic stagnation, and a cultural shift away from the classical Roman ideals that had shaped the empire. In this final part, we will explore the cultural decline of Rome and how the fall of the empire influenced the world long after the last emperor was deposed. We'll also look at the legacy of Rome and what lessons can be drawn from its collapse. The fall of Rome was not just a political and military event, but a profound cultural shift that had long-lasting effects on Europe and the world. The loss of Roman identity? One of the most significant effects of the collapse of the Roman Empire was the loss of the unified Roman identity. For centuries, Rome had been the cultural, political, and military center of the Mediterranean world. Roman citizens, whether in Italy or in distant provinces, shared a sense of Roman identity and pride. This was reflected in the Roman way of life, which included Roman law, Roman architecture, and Roman customs. However, as the empire fragmented, this shared identity began to disappear. With the collapse of centralized power and the rise of local rulers, the Roman culture that had once united such a vast and diverse empire began to fade. The influx of barbarian tribes into the empire, many of whom did not share the Roman way of life, further contributed to this loss of identity. As the central Roman government collapsed, the people who remained in the empire were no longer governed by Roman law or Roman institutions. Instead, they were left with fractured regional governments and local rulers who did not have the same connection to Roman traditions. The barbarian invasions, particularly the Germanic tribes like the Goths and Vandals, brought new cultural influences to the Roman world. These tribes had their own customs, languages, and ways of life, which blended with the remnants of Roman culture. As a result, the Roman world became less Roman and more diverse in terms of culture and governance. The great Roman cities, once thriving hubs of Roman civilization, became places where the ancient Roman way of life was replaced with the customs and practices of various tribes. This loss of Roman identity marked the end of an era, and it left a lasting impact on Western civilization. The fall of the Western Roman Empire led to a period of cultural darkness in much of Europe, as many of the achievements of Rome, including its advanced infrastructure, education system, and technological innovations, were lost or forgotten. It wasn't until much later, during the Renaissance, that these Roman ideas and achievements would be rediscovered and celebrated again. Economic decline and the fall of trade. Along with the loss of Roman culture came a severe economic decline. The Roman Empire had once boasted a highly advanced economy, with a vast trade network stretching from Britain to the Middle East and from Africa to Asia. Roman roads, ports, and cities facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. However, after the empire's collapse, much of this infrastructure fell into disrepair. The breakdown of trade routes, caused by both internal instability and external threats, led to economic stagnation. Without a strong central government to maintain roads, markets, and trade networks, commerce slowed dramatically. Cities that had once been vibrant centers of business and culture became abandoned, as the people fled to rural areas in search of safety. The economy of the Western Roman Empire turned inward, becoming more localized and less connected to the broader Mediterranean world. This decline in trade had serious consequences for the people of the former empire. As cities grew poorer and less connected, the supply of goods dwindled and the cost of everyday necessities rose. The wealth that had once been spread across the empire became concentrated in fewer hands, with local elites taking control of whatever resources remained. The widespread poverty and economic hardships contributed to a decline in literacy, education, and cultural achievements. For centuries after the fall of Rome, much of Europe would struggle to recover from the economic decline caused by the empire's collapse. It wasn't until the medieval period, several hundred years later, that trade began to pick up again, though it was never as advanced as it had been during the Roman Empire. The rise of the Byzantine Empire and the preservation of Roman culture, while the Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to survive and thrive for nearly another 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, inherited much of the culture, law, and political systems of the Roman Empire. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true heirs to the Roman Empire, and they continued many Roman traditions, including the use of Roman law, the Roman system of government, and Roman architecture. They also preserved much of Roman knowledge, including scientific and philosophical works, which had been written in Greek and Latin. In many ways, the Byzantine Empire served as a bridge between the ancient Roman world and the modern world, preserving key elements of Roman culture during the period when much of Europe had slipped into darkness. The Byzantine Empire also played a crucial role in preserving Christianity. While the Roman Empire had officially embraced Christianity under Emperor Constantine, it was the Byzantine Empire that would help spread and protect the Christian faith throughout Europe and beyond. The preservation of Roman law and culture in the Byzantine Empire would later inspire the Renaissance, a period of renewed interest in the art, philosophy, and science of the ancient world. However, the Byzantine Empire eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, marking the end of the last remnants of the Roman Empire. While the empire survived longer than its Western counterpart, it too eventually succumbed to external pressures and internal weaknesses. The cultural shift, the Dark Ages, the period following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is often referred to as the Dark Ages. This term reflects the cultural and economic stagnation that occurred in Europe after Rome's collapse. During this time, Europe saw a decline in learning, art, and scientific progress. The centralized systems of Roman government, law, and education were replaced by a more fragmented, decentralized system of local rulers and warlords. The Dark Ages were marked by instability, as Europe's once thriving cities were abandoned, and the great Roman roads fell into disrepair. The trade networks that had connected the Roman world were disrupted, leading to a lack of goods and resources. This period of instability and hardship was compounded by invasions from Viking, Muslim, and other barbarian groups, further weakening the region. However, it's important to note that the Dark Ages were not a complete period of cultural decline. Christianity played a major role in preserving knowledge during this time. Monasteries, where monks copied ancient texts by hand, became centers of learning and preserved much of the ancient knowledge that would later be rediscovered during the Renaissance. In this way, the collapse of Rome did not entirely erase the Roman legacy. It simply slowed its progress until Europe was ready for the next stage of development. The Renaissance. Rediscovering Roman glory. It wasn't until the 14th century that Europe began to experience a revival of interest in the classical world, known as the Renaissance. This period was marked by a renewed interest in the art, philosophy, and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanists, scholars who studied the classical texts of ancient Rome, sought to bring back the knowledge and wisdom of the Roman Empire. The Renaissance marked a cultural shift in Europe as people rediscovered the achievements of Rome in areas like architecture, law, science, and art. The works of ancient Roman philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists were studied and applied to new ideas in the arts and sciences. This rebirth of classical knowledge laid the foundation for the modern world. The Renaissance also saw the rise of great artists, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, who were inspired by Roman art and architecture. The architectural wonders of Rome, like the Pantheon and the Colosseum, served as models for Renaissance buildings. Roman law, which had been foundational to the development of Western legal systems, was studied and adapted to fit the needs of a changing world. In many ways, the Renaissance was a rebirth of Roman ideals and knowledge, which have been lost for centuries but were now being rediscovered and embraced once again. Lessons from Rome's collapse. The fall of the Roman Empire teaches us several important lessons. The first and most important lesson is the dangers of economic mismanagement. Rome's decision to print cheap money and debase its currency was an attempt to solve short-term financial problems, but it had devastating long-term effects. Inflation, social unrest, and political instability followed, ultimately leading to the collapse of the empire. Another lesson is the importance of unity and strong leadership. The political fragmentation of Rome, with multiple leaders claiming authority and military commanders acting independently, weakened the empire and made it more vulnerable to external threats. Strong leadership and unity are essential for maintaining stability in any nation. Lastly, the Roman Empire's collapse shows us the importance of infrastructure and trade. Rome's roads, aqueducts, and cities were critical to its success. Without these, the empire struggled to function. The collapse of Roman infrastructure contributed to the empire's economic decline and made it harder to recover. The legacy of Rome and what we can learn from its collapse. As we have seen in the previous parts of this series, the collapse of the Roman Empire was a complex and multifaceted event. While the immediate causes of the empire's fall were economic, political, and military in nature, the long-term effects of Rome's collapse were felt across centuries. The legacy of Rome still shapes our world today, from our laws and governance to our architecture and urban planning. In this final part, we will explore how the fall of Rome influenced the world in both the short term and long term. We will also look at the lessons we can learn from Rome's rise and fall, applying them to our own time. Rome's story, though ancient, holds powerful lessons that are still relevant in today's world. The end of the Roman Empire. A turning point in history. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD marked a major turning point in history. With the collapse of the empire, the Roman world was replaced by a period of uncertainty and fragmentation. The once unified Mediterranean world became divided into smaller, often hostile kingdoms and tribal territories. The great cities of the Roman Empire, such as Rome itself, Constantinople, and Carthage, became shadows of their former selves. After the fall of Rome, the world entered what we now call the Middle Ages. This period, which lasted for about 1,000 years, was marked by social and political instability. The centralized government of Rome was replaced by feudal systems, where local lords held power over smaller territories. The fall of trade and the breakdown of infrastructure led to economic stagnation, and learning and culture took a back seat to survival. However, the collapse of the Roman Empire did not erase the Roman legacy entirely. Many of the ideas, institutions, and technologies that had been developed during the Roman era were preserved in different ways. The fall of Rome was not the end of Roman influence. It was the beginning of a long process of transformation, where elements of Roman culture were adapted, preserved, and passed down to future generations. The preservation of Roman culture. The Byzantine Empire. As we have seen earlier, while the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for nearly another 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, saw itself as the true heir to Roman civilization. The Byzantines preserved many aspects of Roman law, governance, and culture. The Byzantine Empire played a crucial role in preserving the Roman legacy, especially during the period when much of Europe was in turmoil. The Byzantines kept Roman law intact, particularly the corpus juris civilis, which would later influence the development of legal systems in Europe. The Byzantine Empire was also responsible for preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts, many of which would be rediscovered during the Renaissance. Byzantine architecture, especially the Hagia Sophia, also drew heavily from Roman design principles. The legacy of Roman engineering, including the use of arches, domes, and advanced construction techniques, was carried on by the Byzantines, influencing architecture for centuries to come. The influence of Roman law and governance. One of Rome's most enduring legacies is its legal system. Roman law laid the foundations for many legal systems in the Western world. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, was one of the most important legal codes in history. It preserved many Roman principles of law, such as the ideas of justice, property rights, and citizenship. Roman law had a significant influence on the development of modern legal systems in Europe. For example, the legal codes of many European countries, such as the Napoleonic Code in France, were inspired by Roman law. The principle of innocent until proven guilty, which is fundamental in modern legal systems, is rooted in Roman legal traditions. Roman governance, too, left a lasting mark on political thought. The idea of republicanism, with elected leaders and a system of checks and balances, influenced the development of democratic systems in the West. The Roman Senate, while far from perfect, inspired the design of legislative bodies in many modern nations, including the United States Senate. The Romans also developed a complex bureaucracy, which would later influence the administration of empires and nations throughout history. Roman architecture and engineering. Roman architecture and engineering were some of the most advanced in the ancient world. The Romans were known for their monumental structures, including the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Roman Forum. These buildings were not just symbols of power and wealth, but also marvels of engineering and design. The Romans were pioneers in the use of concrete, which allowed them to build large, durable structures that have survived for centuries. Roman innovations in architecture and engineering laid the groundwork for future civilizations. The Roman arch, dome, and vault became fundamental elements of architectural design in later periods. The Romans also constructed extensive road networks that spanned the empire, facilitating trade, communication, and military movements. These roads became the foundation for modern highways and transportation systems. Roman engineering achievements, such as the construction of aqueducts to bring water into cities and sewer systems to remove waste, were incredibly advanced for their time. These innovations helped to create healthy and well-organized urban environments, and their influence can still be seen in modern urban planning and infrastructure. The Dark Ages, the aftermath of Rome's collapse. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe entered a period known as the Dark Ages. This was a time marked by political instability, economic decline, and cultural fragmentation. Without the unified Roman Empire to maintain order, Europe became divided into smaller kingdoms, many of which were constantly at war with each other. The lack of central governance and the breakdown of trade networks led to widespread poverty and social upheaval. During this time, much of the knowledge of the ancient world was lost. The fall of Roman schools, libraries, and institutions meant that many of the achievements of Roman civilization were forgotten or ignored for centuries. The Dark Ages were a period when survival took precedence over learning and cultural advancement. However, the Catholic Church played a crucial role in preserving knowledge during this time. Monasteries became centers of learning where monks copied ancient manuscripts by hand. These texts, many of which contained the works of ancient Roman philosophers, scientists, and historians, were preserved in these monasteries and would later be rediscovered during the Renaissance. The Renaissance, the rebirth of Roman culture. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century, was a period of renewed interest in the art, literature, and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. Scholars known as humanists began to study and revive the works of Roman philosophers, writers, and scientists. They saw themselves as reviving the ideals of Roman civilization and applying them to the modern world. Renaissance artists, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, were inspired by the classical ideals of balance, proportion, and beauty that had characterized Roman art and architecture. These artists used Roman techniques, such as perspective, to create stunning works of art that are still admired today. The Pantheon, with its perfect dome, inspired many Renaissance architects, and the Colosseum served as a model for large public buildings. The Renaissance also saw a revival of Roman law and governance. Humanists believed that Roman political ideas, such as the notion of citizenship and the importance of public service, could be applied to modern governments. This led to the development of democratic ideas in Europe, which would later influence the creation of modern democratic governments. The lessons we can learn from Rome's collapse. The fall of the Roman Empire offers us several important lessons. One of the most important is the danger of economic mismanagement. Rome's decision to print more money to solve its financial problems led to inflation, which weakened the economy and contributed to the empire's collapse. The lesson here is that short-term solutions, especially those that seem to solve immediate financial problems, can have devastating long-term consequences. Another important lesson is the importance of strong leadership and unity. The political fragmentation of the Roman Empire weakened its ability to respond to external threats. When the military became divided and various generals declared themselves emperors, it became impossible for Rome to defend itself effectively. The lesson here is that strong, unified leadership is essential for maintaining stability and security in any society. Finally, the collapse of Rome reminds us of the importance of preserving culture and knowledge. The fall of Roman institutions and the breakdown of education during the Dark Ages led to a loss of much of the knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries. This shows us the importance of education and cultural preservation for the advancement of civilization. The Renaissance would not have been possible without the efforts of those who preserved and rediscovered the knowledge of ancient Rome.